thank you very much for giving up some time to the Mint.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, I read your book with fascination, which is obviously about sweatshops. So I wonder if we could start with you giving a brief explanation of why sweatshops are such an essential part of the economy in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, of course. In order to understand why they have developed, we really need to go back to the beginning of globalization, so the 1960s onwards. And in that time, corporations have increasingly moved their labor-intensive production from countries in the so-called global north to countries in the so-called global south, countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, as well as countries like Honduras. The aim was to lower their overall production costs in order to be able to compete in a now globalized market. And one very effective means to that end is to cut or lower labor costs. To that end, the countries in the so-called global south and former colonies were particularly attractive because they had a vast number of workers who were looking for a job. They had very low labor regulations, and governments in these countries often tried to attract foreign investment, for instance, by offering tax exemptions or offering lower labor and health regulations for these companies that then would outsource their labor-intensive production work there. This combination of the conditions that were already in place, many people looking for a job, lower labor regulations, and the fact that these companies actively sought to lower their labor costs meant that these countries were a perfect breeding ground, so to say, for as we know them today.
Brilliant. So can you explain that there's two ways global capitalism can work, isn't there? One is to maintain labor but reduce its cost, and the other way is to automate and to effectively get rid of labor and hence reduce cost as well. Why was that second strategy not available?
Automation, you mean, as a way to cut labor costs? Well, we see that it is increasingly available now. We see that some of the sweatshops that were formerly there are no longer sweatshops precisely because automation is now cheaper to lower overall production costs. But in sweatshops in the textile industry, that work wasn't as easily automated as other industries were. And as well, the costs were so cheap anyways that I think the kind of initial investment in automating all of these tasks just wasn't worth it in the same way that it might have been in other industries. And so I think what we see is that overall production costs were easily lowered by just outsourcing labor to these countries.
And I suppose it also means it's more flexible in terms of labor. You can move around to do different sorts of tasks, can't you? So how do they work and how bad are these sweatshops? Have they got worse or better, given, I suppose, there's been a certain amount of pressure from consumers to improve them, hasn't there?
Yeah, just in terms of how they work, maybe to give you an overall example how a typical supply chain is structured. Typically what happens is that brands, big brands, typically located in countries like the US, they design the product. They design, for instance, the garment that they want to sell. And then they outsource or work with intermediary suppliers who then in turn contract local factories that are responsible for producing the garment. What we see then, and usually it's much more complex than this is already a simplified version of a global supply chain. What we see then is there are multiple actors along global supply chains that have responsibilities, which makes it hard to assign accountability or responsibility for labor violations that happen in these factories, in the places where the garment is produced. Now, what that means is that the working conditions in these factories where the garment is produced tend to be pretty bad. What that means is workers have very low wages that often don't even cover the most basic necessities. Oftentimes, workers in sweatshops have to take out additional loans that then trap them in a loan circle where they have to continue working in a sweatshop to be able to repay their loans. These sweatshops often include very long working hours, so between 10 to 12 days, again, depending on the industry and the context, and very often also forced overtime, which depending on the production cycle, because fashion works in these very high rushed cycles where a few months there's a lot of pressure on producing very quickly, and then maybe there's a few weeks and months where the pressure is lower. But in these high pressure moments, workers are often forced to work longer or work overtime, often unpaid overtime. What we also see, and that's symptomatic of the garment industry as well, is the health and safety issues that are systematic in the garment factories. One example here that is probably the most paradigmatic or famous example is the collapse of the Rana Plaza factory, a garment factory in Bangladesh in 2013 that killed 1,134 workers and left many more injured. That happened as a result just of a neglect of health and safety regulations. Another thing just to mention, and I'll close with that, is that there's widespread and systematic sexual harassment that's used as a disciplinary tool to discipline the mostly women workers. About 80% of the workers in the garment factories are women. So we have a combination of things, right? Lower wages, or very low wages, long hours, systematic health and safety hazards, as well as harassment. And then there's often also restrictions on unions and collective bargaining, which makes it much harder for the workers to organize in order to fight back.
So does anyone defend the brands, etc.? Do they just claim that their supply chains are different, or is there anyone who stands up and provides a defense of this position?
I think there are there are definitely defenses, and some have made it into the more philosophical justifications of sweatshops. Let me just pick out maybe two that are particularly prominent, and they're often also the ones that the brands back to, which is one that sweatshops, while they're not ideal, are a driver for development, and as such offer better alternatives to the workers who are in these countries and who without sweatshops wouldn't have decent work anyway. So the idea is, look, we know there are problems here, but at least the option of working in a sweatshop is better than the option of not working at all or working in other industries that might be even worse. And so the idea would be, well, in the long run, actually, sweatshops contribute to the overall development of the country and hence provide more job opportunities, more prosperity, etc. in the long run. So that's one way in which it's defended. A second way that's maybe particularly interesting from my perspective, because I look at the feminist implications of sweatshop labor, is to say, well, that sweatshops, because in the garment industry in particular, because they employ so many women, that can also be seen as a driver for gender emancipation or gender equality, because women can become economically independent through sweatshop work. And then, of course, what companies do is say, look, so what I'm thinking of is something like H&M's collection. So say, look, we actually, we make sure that the products that are produced in these sweatshops, or that at least they're in some sense conscious, whatever that might mean, because it's very clear that H&M, for instance, uses sweatshop labor as well. So maybe I'll leave it there.
And it is sort of true, isn't it? That, I mean, we had an article in the past by someone doing research in Bangladesh sweatshops that found that the dangers that women faced outside the sweatshop in their everyday lives on the journey to the sweatshop was as bad or worse than actually being in the sweatshop. Pay rates are lower in other industries, agriculture, or what other options they have.
Yeah, I think so maybe that will also get us to the question of why it's so important to think about the structural conditions of sweatshop labor, because it is true, right? If you look at very specific instances, it is true that wages tend to be better in sweatshops with qualifications, depending on the specific context. I would tend to be better for some workers, at least, than other industries. And there might be an argument, so it's maybe not all wrong, that there is something to the argument that women might gain economic independence, or at least a bit. But I think we need to be really careful here to think about the ways, or to isolate these specific instances from the broader social structures. And what we want to ask is, why is it, though, that sweatshops present a better alternative? Why is it that this choice is presented to the workers? And if we zoom in and look at the ways in which, for instance, the history of slavery, colonial resource exploitation, imperial restructuring of labor markets, as well as the ways in which the international trading rules are often stacked against particular countries, all of these, and these are just examples, right? So all of these have a significant impact on the option set that workers have available to them in particular countries. And in addition to that, right, if we look at the option set that workers have available, then if we zoom in specifically on the way in which gender and race in particular, as well as migration status come in here, and further limit, for instance, women workers' access to particular industries that are very male dominated, or, as you say, the means available to get to one job safely. All of these aspects impact on what kind of jobs are available for women workers in the first place. And so while sweatshop labor might be a better option, and again, this is also debatable, right, to what extent that is actually true, but like for the sake of argument, assuming that it might be a better option than those available, it still is a better option within a set of really bad options, right, that themselves unjust to the workers. And so I think we really need to understand how sweatshop labor is embedded in this wider structure that limits the option set in the first place.
And in a structure, I think you talk about where people are more vulnerable, their negotiating position because of the wider system they live in is very weak. They may be migrants and so on. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think in particular, in the case of migrant workers, that's a really good example. Here we see how labor draws massively on migrant workers. And what we see is that because oftentimes either they don't have any visas, so they're illegalized workers, or their visa is bound to very specific employers, they have very limited options to exit exploitative working arrangements. What happens is that they face a choice between either losing their job and potentially being deported back to their countries, or having to go into even worse employment because they don't have the legal right to work, and then that closes off a lot of possible other decent jobs. So that means that their exit options are very limited. And so they're particularly vulnerable to being exploited, to being paid very low wages, to being forced to stay for overtime, all of that. So that's a really important factor here.
Would this be called modern slavery if it was happening in England, by reducing options for people that they have to accept, particular to survive? Isn't that a type of modern slavery?
It is called that in some instances, I think. So one argument I make in the book is to say, look, these exploitative working conditions systematically tied to different forms of force and violence. So the force and the violence, and be that the threat of exclusion from the workforce, or the oftentimes physical force to maintain workers inside the factory to work longer hours, something like shutting the doors, that's happening in the industry, or the systematic threats of sexual violence. These are forms of violence that are necessary to sustain these exploitative working arrangements because they're needed to keep workers on their toes and to keep them disciplined. And so I think there are definitely instances of modern slavery within kind of sweatshop labor relations. I'm a bit hesitant to call all of that modern slavery, precisely because I think modern slavery denotes something very particular. Slavery is something where one loses one's whole kind of status, someone who's free and equal in some sense. And I think this is something that we should be wary of, kind of overextending that notion to every labor relation. But I think it's important to see how modern slavery, or the mechanisms associated with it, are a crucial part of what sustains the, at least prima facie, more kind of contractual labor relations within sweatshop labor. So when people say, look, but the workers' contract, they sign a contract, and that's different to modern slavery because at least formally they're free. Then we can say, yes, that there are some contractual labor relations, but we need to understand how these are linked, right, to these processes of violence and exclusion and marginalization, and wouldn't work in the way they are if these weren't also present.
So what can be done to challenge these exploitative structures?
So here I think it's important first to note that we should refrain from moralizing these structures. So what tends to happen sometimes is that we think, well, sweatshops are bad because there are some bad employers, right? So some people exploit and they're morally bad and they should be blamed for exploiting. And then once we take out these few bad apples, the problem is also gone. And because I think it's a structural problem, that of course also has implications for what can be done. So just let me give you an example to make this less abstract. So if we say, look, we see supervisors on the factory floors behaving badly. So they prohibit their workers from taking pee breaks, or they tell them you have to stay longer or you get fired. I think then there's maybe an idea that, well, these are the people that we should actually punish, right? But then these people, the factory supervisors, their jobs tend to be on the line as well, right? If they don't follow orders from, say, the management of the sweatshop. And the management of the sweatshop or the sweatshop owners with whom they work, they're worried that they might get put out of the market. They need to compete with other, factories that also bid for the same contract. So there's a whole situation in which there's a lot of different constraints. And I'm not saying that they're not individuals in sweatshops labor who act very badly and that there's no personal responsibility, but I think the focus should be on the ways in which these structures that make sweatshop labor possible in the first place can be challenged. And there's, of course, different points of entry here. So one is, I think, that unions play a central role. So when we have seen changes being enacted in sweatshop labor, so be that better contracts, higher wages, sick leave, or maternity leave, when we have seen those changes being enacted, it was usually because there was a drive by the union, a strong union, that would bring that about. So supporting unions, be that through global legislation, or be that, for instance, through international solidarity, so unions across, supporting unions in Bangladesh through unionized work in the UK, say, something like that. That's, I think, one important point of entry. Another, of course, are international rules. So because so much of what companies can do at the moment is that they're still, to some extent, relatively free to do whatever they want to do. And rules such as, for instance, there's now an EU supply chain law, which is designed specifically to hold companies, for instance, companies who are based in Germany, accountable for labor rights violations along their supply chains, even if they're not the ones employing the people. So these things can also have an effect. And then as well, I think maybe just the third example here would be something like putting pressure on companies in the so-called global north. So this is one strategy that the anti-sweatshop movement in the 90s and early 2000s followed, which was to pressure, for instance, universities in the US who had contracts with sweatshops or whose garment was produced in sweatshops to make sure that these licensees or that the suppliers they worked with complied with certain labor standards. So these are just a few examples of how kind of where points of entry are that are much more on the structural level. Yeah.
What about the issue that there seems to be an unequal capture of value in the supply chain, in that the people who are doing the design and the marketing are getting much more of the value than the people who are actually making the garments? And I wonder if there have been attempts in Bangladesh or other global south countries for indigenous captures of value, actually producing designs locally, using the internet to market direct, etc., that might then allow better pay to people who are making the garments.
Yeah, there are a number of initiatives. So one that I find particularly interesting is it's called Estilo Diversa. That's an initiative in Argentina, which does precisely that. I think tries to capture value at the local level at the same time that it tries to bring in people from the LGBTQI community and like have that be a space for workers, particularly from those communities who don't have access to other workplaces as easily, or often are marginalized from the labor market, and works with them and tries to bring the process back, starting from design to production and then selling it for the local labor market. I think the challenge here is, of course, that companies come with so many more resources and precisely because they can lower their labor costs or are willing to do that, they can sell products much cheaper and produce them much cheaper. But I think there is maybe also in perhaps countries in the West a growing awareness, desire perhaps to have one's clothes be produced in more ethical ways. And of course, that meets a cost of living crisis where people also have to buy clothes and don't have the money to pay for clothes that are often much more expensive. So I guess this is the thing. There's so many different factors that come in here as well.
So have there been, if you look across the board, would you pick out any particularly more successful attempt to challenge the exploitation that has been sustained?
So I talk about one example in the book that Asha Kumar and Jack Mahoney talk about in one of their articles, which is, I think, a really successful example of a combination of a workers-led collaborative endeavor between workers in Honduras and the anti-sweatshop movement in the US. So what happened was that in 2007, there was a number of workers who started to unionize in some factories, in some garment factories in Choloma in Honduras. And there was immediately a threat that the companies would be shut down, or that these workers would be fired, or the leaders of the unionization efforts would be fired. And this also happened. So one of the companies actually shut down. And as a result of that, workers that started to unionize, they got into contact with the then emerging anti-sweatshop movement in the US. So this was a student-led movement, but that was involved with some of the major garment unions in the US. And through that collaboration, what happened was that the student movement pressured their universities to withdraw licenses, or at least to threaten to withdraw licenses from like some of the suppliers of these companies where the workers had been fired or that had been closed. And they also managed to establish direct worker-manager negotiations, which was really important to the Honduran workers, that they would be the ones to lead the negotiations. And so effectively what happened was that after a time, the company was the factory was reopened, and the workers were reinstated. So I think this was a really good example of one of the ways in which a worker-led collaboration between the workers and the anti-sweatshop movement were actually quite effective.
Are there relationships still in place between the anti-sweatshop movement and Honduras?
And the anti-sweatshop movement has changed a bit and has globalized as well. So what we see is very similar structures. We see them more institutionalized in organizations such as the Clean Clothes Campaign, who also works with local actors and in particular unions and labor rights activists on the ground, and tries to support or collaborate with them, with unions in the Western countries, or students or other members of the anti-sweatshop movement. So I'm not sure to what extent this concrete collaboration has endured, but certainly in other forms and in globalized forms, we see that at a much more institutional level taking place today.
Well, that is a positive note to end on. And thank you very much, Mirjam, for giving your time, talking about what is a very interesting but also horrifying situation. And it's interesting how we rely on so much exploitation around the world that is hidden away from us.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Pleasure talking.